have 10 to the 5 or 10 to the 6 productions or associations or whatever you call them. We're only up to 10,000, barely started. It has to have a sense of history and place. In the modern terms, it's got to be situated, okay? It's got to be a system with a sense of self. It's got to learn from a social community. All of these things are real problems. All of them, if I take Werner Reichert's view, are each worth 5 years, all right? So clearly I don't have a chance, okay? Someplace down in here, it's all over. So it will surely outlast me, and so I've essentially done exactly what Fritz Machliff's done, except that's all not true. SOAR is not a final project. It's simply the next project that comes along. In fact, if you look at the time it was chosen, which was 83, I was only 56 at the time, much too early to be choosing the final project. The choice, however, was strategic. It was finally coming back and picking as a goal all of the things that were focused on that central desire to understand the nature of the human mind. The fact that you see such a massive commitment to it is really, I won't go through this because we already have kind of, it's really the fact that it turns out to be a confluence of so many things that seem right. All right. So that's about it. So I sort of sprinkled throughout this thing a bunch of maxims, which I think, at least when I hear myself saying them to my graduate students, I think that they probably characterize my own scientific life. So the maximum that holds for this last slide is to each scientific style its own maxims. The maxims that I've told you about don't necessarily apply to other scientific styles. On the other hand, there are in fact a bunch of maxims which didn't quite make it in to that particular way of viewing my scientific life, and I thought that a suitable sort of tattered way of ending this talk would be to just go over some of the other maxims that I have found useful and that, in fact, I think are entirely appropriate for the scientific style in which I've lived, but not necessarily other ones. So here's the first one. So this is a random collection. This is a random residual. First one, if you want to work with the results of field X, you've got to be a professional in X. To wit, no interdisciplinary activity. And I've got some good examples of this. In cognitive psychology, which was central for me, is central for me in understanding the nature of human cognition, I had to become a cognitive psychologist. I couldn't depend upon my cognitive psychological friends. Okay, now, in fact, what that means, as some of the psychologists around here will verify, is psychologists have a way of dealing with issues. They sit there and they sort of shout studies at each other. And one person says, the study by so-and-so shows this. And you got to respond, oh, but that study is flawed in this particular way. To which someone else says, but this study shows this. And you say, but I have another study which shows this. Okay, now, in fact, that's the way cognitive psychologists talk when they're together. If you can't talk that way, if it turns out that you don't know essentially every study that's laid on the conversational table, you are not a cognitive psychologist. So being a cognitive psychologist means to immerse yourself so deeply in cognitive psychology that you can play that game. And I did, and I do play that game. Okay? I got a bunch of interesting anecdotes I won't tell you but could about that. On the other hand, the linguists play a different game. They play a game of making up counterexamples. They make up these interesting sentences which they zing at each other across the table. And you have to deal in real time online with all those counterexamples by making up other counterexamples of your own or denying, in fact, that that's grammatical or whatever. Okay? Very different game from what the cognitive psychologists do. Now, it turns out, well, I don't know about the neuropsychologists. They're so embedded in anatomical language that I can't even follow them, it turns out. But it turns out that this one I did, and these two I didn't. And so consequently, I have never, and been crippled this way, I have never in all of my professional life really dealt with linguistics adequately, and I certainly have been unwilling to deal with brain-damaged patients and studies and information and so forth, what's now called neurocognitive psychology, simply because in some sense I wasn't a professional in either of these areas, and so it wasn't safe for me to go use them. And I think this is true. I don't believe it when they tell you that what you need to do is to collaborate with a psychologist and he will do this for you, or she will do this for you. They won't and they can't. If you want to work across fields, you become professionals in both fields. Second one, we are all flawed. Okay? We all carry our burden of incapacity, and the real thing about that is you want to know them like the back of your hand, and you don't want to fight them. In my own case, the issue is I'm not a mathematician. Now, I know I'm not a mathematician because, in fact, I spent a year as a graduate student at Princeton in Fine Hall, which is the temple of pure mathematics. Okay? And I came away from that understanding that I was never going to be a real mathematician. I was never going to prove any of those deep theorems. In fact, I was never going to prove any of those undeep theorems. Okay? And I have designed my scientific life, in some sense, to simply deal with that. I don't fight it. I know that I'm limited in that respect, and so I work with the things where I'm strong. I understand my flaws, and I stay away from them. Here's a hard one. There is no substitute for working hard, very hard. Okay? I tell this to my graduate students all the time. Just like in professional sports, in professional music, on the concert stage, and so forth, the people who are out there and are going to get the goal, the people who are going to find out what the nature of the mind is the people who are not only brilliant and creative, but work very hard. And you can be as brilliant as you want and as creative as you want, and if you don't work hard, someone's going to get there first. Okay, and it's a hard story, but it's just very, very true. If you don't want to work that hard, don't go after this scientific style of picking up one of these goals. And you look around and you see that that's really true about the scientists who have made those kind of goals. And it just comes out of this notion of competition at the margin of excellence. And that's all that's going on. It's just as true of professional sports as it is science. But unfortunately, it's just as true of science as it is of professional sports. All right. So how do new things get started? In all of the experience I've had, they always get started by evolution. That is, we're in a situation like that big failure, and out of that failure comes the ashes, which tell that instructable production system product, which tell you how to proceed next. That happens all the time in every scientific endeavor. Or they come from chance. I didn't ask Oliver Selfridge to visit that day. Oliver arrives. I didn't know him from Adam. He gives these talks. There I am. I'm hooked for the rest of my life. Okay, they do not happen by design. I have designed a large number of starts in my life. Almost all of them have gone down the tube. So I designed this instructable production system project. Didn't work. So the next one, okay, so that's all. So here's another version that I feel most deeply about. A scientist is a transducer from nature to theory. Don't kid yourself that you have very much to offer. Your problem is to go listen to nature, transduce what it has to say into a theory, but don't believe that the theory is coming from you. It's coming from nature. So the name of the game is to seek out nature and listen to it. Back in the 60s, whenever I used to go home kind of depressed because I felt I hadn't learned anything in a week, I would take a new protocol, and I would take an evening and I would clear the evening away. And I'd spend an evening with that protocol, and I would always find out something about human behavior that I didn't know. Okay, just listen to nature. Those of you who, to hear me say on SOAR, listen to the architecture, it's just a version of that same maxim. This is simply my version of Herb's Have a Secret Weapon. Here the secret weapon is every scientist should have a piece of nature that nobody else knows about that you can listen to that tells you what to do. I don't know what the mathematicians do on that. But then I'm not a mathematician, you see. All right. So here's the last one. The science is in the technique. All else is commentary. All right? All that lives in science are those techniques, based on theory, of course, but are those techniques which your scientific descendants must use to solve their problems. We know about Hamilton because there's a thing called the Hamiltonian.